Good afternoon from Anderson Forge. I haven't put myself in front of the camera for quite a while. Maybe a couple little forging videos, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you guys or whoever's going to watch this video, right? For a long time, I've been doing these individual videos on the individual knives, and if you're even remotely familiar with my YouTube channel, you've seen me do 100 knives. And I like having a video record, and as much as anything else, those videos are for the customers who are getting those knives. They can see individual characteristics of each knife, and I usually discuss the components or maybe a little bit of the thought process that went into the making of those knives. So that's a record. And I don't have a life anyway, right? I make knives and I sleep, so I upload the video to YouTube at night while I'm sleeping. I'm not supposed to be looking at that knife yet. I had it laying out. Anyway, I'm going to do it just a little. This knife I thought deserved just a little bit more than the generic 4-minute movie on the knife. So I'm going to talk a little while. It usually takes me about a paragraph to say what other people can say in one sentence, so I apologize in advance. But this knife means something to me. It's not just a knife that made for personal specs or customers' specs. There's some history behind this knife, and the components used are worth mentioning as well. So I'm just going to do a kind of an introduction on a knife that I hope I make many of, because it's something that I've been searching for since day one. I'm going to go back a little ways. A little bit of my history was I grew up, we grew up pheasant hunting and deer hunting and squirrel and rabbit and quail hunting and fishing wherever there was water. And I grew up in Minnesota, and we did those things not only for the social pleasure of getting people together and having that moment together, but literally for food. And so I spent my life outdoors doing something. Well, and I'm a bow hunter. I'm what they call a traditional bow hunter, because we're using traditional equipment. Most of it handmade stuff, longbows and recurves and that sort of thing. And I did have a compound bow, the mechanical wheelie type gadget. I had one in the 80s. I didn't get the pleasure out of it that I did a handmade bow. I've been making my own arrows for 40 years. One day, jumped forward, and I remember specifically, I started making knives in '96, and this was before I started making knives, so I'm going to guess it was the fall of 1995. I had a deer on the ground. I was field dressing this deer. Me and a couple buddies had some really nice hunting ground along a river, and I built a whole bunch of ladder stands. So here I was on the ground about to dress out this deer that I had shot from a ladder stand that I had built with a bow that I had made at that time by a fellow who lived in Michigan. I shot it with an arrow that I had built myself out of Port Orford cedar shaft, and it was fletched. That's the feathers on the end to give it stability. It was called fletching. I had fletched it with goose feathers from a goose that I had shot. And here I was about to dress it out, field dress this deer, with a knife that, I probably bought at a hardware store. And I remember distinctly thinking, this deer deserves better than that. I would think, as capable as I am, I should be able to make a knife. Well, a year went by, and the next thing I knew, I had discovered literally Blade magazine, and the rest is history. Here I am making knives still 20 years later. Well, I always wanted to make a knife. I wanted to make a hunting knife. We'll call it a hunting knife, a belt knife, a utility knife that a person could wear, use. And just to go back just a second, the bow that I shot that deer with was a takedown recurve, meaning you have the riser and the limbs and it would come apart. Because I had a gold wing motorcycle at the time, I'd go to these 3D archery shoots. I wanted to be able to pack my bow on a motorcycle rather than have this thing like this. It would come apart. So I thought it would be pretty cool to have knives that came apart, and I met world-class knife maker Jerry Radis and taught me how to make a takedown knife, and I've been doing it ever since. It seemed to me the takedown assembly lent itself well to using a knife, because keep in mind we're using simple carbon steels, non-stainless steels, so we can forge these knives out of a lot of different materials, but they're not stainless. So I wanted to make a knife that would come apart, you clean it up, you go use it in the field, you go duck hunting or deer hunting, moose hunting. I've got knives in dressing alligator in Australia and moose in Sweden and wild boar in Louisiana and caribou in Alaska, and who knows what they dress in South America. But I wanted the person to be able to take that knife apart, clean it up, oil it, put it back together, and know that his knife was not literally rusting apart. And that has worked very well for a long time. I've never had one of those knives come back, ever, to fix or anything broken or didn't work or whatever. I've never had to fix one of those knives in 2 decades of knife making. So that says a lot for that assembly. Well, and I've made these knives out of simple carbon tool steels and stainless San Mai, which I liked because about 3/4 of the surface area of the knife is a stainless steel jacket. Damascus, etched knives with hamons, and on. Every kind of steel that a forging knife maker can use, I've used. Well, 2 decades later, a couple things have finally fallen in place, and I made a knife that I think is very, very well suited to between my lines of knife making. It's forged, it's takedown, and it's corrosion resistant, abrasion resistant, should lend itself real well. You know, I forgot something. I'm not going to go get it now. I'll just tell you. If I don't forget, I'll circle back around to this. I mean, I'll say it right now. We even mention a lot of times to our customers that not to leave simple carbon blade steel knives in sheaths for long periods of time, because the chemicals that are used in the tanning of sheaths will rust the heck out of a knife. And I have one that's been sitting on top of my gun cabinet for a long time, and I pulled it out the other day and one whole side is just rusted. Leather holds moisture, and it's got chemicals in it. It cannot be pretty. So, and a takedown knife, we got to admit, is all those fine little lines, those joints between the blade and the guard and the handle and the finial on the rear are not waterproof. They're not environment proof. I mean, you could grease them up, and maybe block some things, but so when you're in the field and you're using this knife, you don't want to just leave it, on a week horseback into the mountains and then get home before you clean it up. You might have some rust or whatever. So there's downsides to everything, but at least it was takedown and you can clean it up and make that knife happy again. Well, a lot of that doesn't have any specific direction, but there's a lot of ramifications, a lot of variables to a hunting knife. Quote, end quote, hunting knife. Belt knife, utility knife, field knife. How about a field knife? So, and the steels we have used for years, not necessarily designed for knife blades. I mean, like, I'm a big fan of W1. You can get it at Fastenal, and any increment, it's drill rod steel. Any size you can get a drill bit in, 11/64 or 6.5 millimeters or whatever you want, you can get W1 tool steel. Forges nicely, heat treats easy. It's a very low alloy, shallow hardening, nicely performing. Somebody sending me a text message. Actually, the guy who's coming tomorrow picked this knife up. And this is the first one of its kind. So anyway, I'll start with the blade steel of this knife. Back in 2009, Crucible Steel did one big melt of a steel that was designed for the forging knife maker. I mentioned that W1 because we use it, but it's designed for drill bits. It's not designed for cutting instruments. We use, just to use like 5160 for example, got a lot of chromium for the chromium carbides, makes it real tough. Low carbon so it doesn't get super hard, makes a good spring. But we learned how to use it. That's my, sorry about that. We learned how to use it to make knives. 15N20 bandsaw steel, but we use it in Damascus and fillet knives because it's tough, but it wasn't designed for knives. Well, somebody had this idea, let's make a steel that's designed for the forging knife maker. And Crucible Steel came up with a really low alloy, 1% carbon steel. And for those who don't know, usually about 95% of a knife steel, of the steel used in a knife blade, here's a knife, it's almost 95% iron. And then they sprinkle in some vanadium, manganese, carbon, a lot of different alloys that give it different properties. So this Crucible Steel came up with a very simple recipe, low alloy steel, and one of the people who helped design it was a knife maker, and this is fact. I talked to the metallurgist on that project 2 different times, and he worked with a knife maker by the name of Dan Farr. And one of the times I was talking to this metallurgist, he said Dan was so critical and valuable in the design of this steel that when it came time to name it, because this is a big company, you know, they patent things and name things and so forth. Anyway, this guy wanted to name that steel. It's Crucible Steel, remember. He wanted to call it Cru-Forge-V. V is because it has some vanadium in it, which helps in the hardening process. We're not going to get into metallurgy. But he wanted to name it Cru-Forge-V. Well, when it went up to the board for the name, they couldn't use this knife maker's name because he was not an employee of Crucible. I see a little speck on my camera. I hope that hasn't been a problem. Anyway, there was a particle on the lens. So they named it Cru-Forge-V. So the steel I'm using is made Cru-Forge-V. So they went to the steel mill and they had this big, they call it a melt, a big bunch of this stuff made. And right after they made the Cru-Forge-V, they went into Chapter 11 and bankruptcy and that stuff and did their restructuring. And when they came back into production as a knife company, they never made it again. So it was a once and done melt of steel, and it was made in 2009. I have an original spec sheet on it, but I just printed this. And it says Cru-Forge-V is a vanadium modified high carbon blade steel specifically designed to offer the forgeability of carbon steels such as W1 1086 or 52-100 while providing improved wear resistance in finished blades. The addition of vanadium promotes the formation of hard vanadium carbides in the microstructure, adding to the abrasive wear resistance of the material compared to plain high-carbon steels. It may be readily forged and heat-treated using standard practices used for high-carbon blade steels. And the part where it says that vanadium adds to the abrasive wear resistance can be attested to by any other knife maker out there who's tried to hand sand Cru-Forge-V. Once you get past about 220, 400 grit sandpaper, just slide on it, doesn't even hardly scratch it. So this stuff's really tough. Low alloy, it has 1.05% carbon, 0.5% of chromium, 0.75% of vanadium, and 0.75% manganese, and that's it. So it's a very simple forging steel. Then I learned, I'm going to have you hear this, been through contacting a handful of other knife makers who have been parkerizing longer than I have. I finally got myself dialed in on parkerizing. Everybody has their own different process. When you get the instructions on parkerizing, it tells you exactly how to do it. But when you talk to half a dozen people how they do it, they've all changed it some way. You make it their own. So I talked to this and this and this and this knife maker, and I finally just decided I need to figure out what happens in my shop, which is usually the way knife makers succeed anyways, finding out what works for them. So I got my parkerizing dialed in, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to go to Google and let Google tell you. I hope it says what it is. What is parkerizing?
According to Wikipedia, parkerizing, bonderizing, phosphating, or phosphatizing is a method of protecting a steel surface from corrosion and increasing its resistance to wear through the application of a chemical phosphate conversion coating.
Okay, I hope that came across. It is a chemical phosphate conversion coating. It's came about in the late 1800s, 19th century, and in the early 20th century it was used a lot by the military. It's a conversion, means it's converting the iron that's on the surface, converts it in, makes it something else, which is, and it's a manganese phosphate coating that bonds with the iron on the surface of the steel. It's very tough. It's very scratched. It's abrasion resistant. Means you can't scratch it. It's used on a lot of firearms. It was adopted by the military. It helped keep things from rusting and pitting and getting locked up in use, in field use. The specific thing about it is microscopically it's very porous. So you can literally put a couple, if you have one dry, you can put a couple drops of oil on it and rub it with your finger and the oil disappears. It literally goes into this converted surface because it's microscopically porous. It holds oil. So if you go on the back end, if you wash and clean and dry and use detergent on something that has been manganese phosphated, you need to reapply oil because I don't know what would happen in the long term, but you break down the oil, you just replace it. So, I made a knife. I'm going to get to the end of this. Quit dragging it out. I have literally been talking for 19 minutes. So I wanted to make a hunting knife. I've made a hunting knife. There was a knife I designed some years ago, a combination of other things I had learned and knives I had seen, and I named it the White Iron Hunter. I am a canoeer. I am a wilderness kind of guy. I get in a canoe and head off into the sticks and come back in a number of days or weeks, whatever, and live out of the canoe. Well, you got to have some good equipment. So I take a knife, and I do a lot of this in the Boundary Waters canoe area wilderness on the Ontario-Minnesota border. And there's a lake there called White Iron Lake. So I named this knife in honor of a lake up there, White Iron Hunter. This is a knife Entirely different, but I call it the Black Iron Hunter. And I'm going to show it to you. And that's a lot of talking about a knife that I think is very well suited to being used outdoors. Abrasion resistant, corrosion resistant. It's forged simple carbon steel. It's sharpen easily, hold an edge long time. It won't rust. It's purty. And this is the Black Iron Hunter. And it's a black sheath. Now I'm going to pull it out. I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to wipe it real quick. This is Black Iron Hunter. And I hope you guys can see this. Cru-Forge-V. Oh, hang on just a second. This is what it's forged from. This is 1 1/8 inch diameter Cru-Forge-V. And I will also say that I have a finite supply of that, and when it's gone, it's gone. It's not like I can go out and buy a bunch more Cru-Forge-V. So when it's gone, I'll forge more knives out of this, out of probably W1. I just really, really like W1. So anyway, this is the Cru-Forge-V. Cru-Forge-V blade. Parkerized. Abrasion resistant. Corrosion resistant. The guard, if you can pardon me again, the guard is just simply made out of, I don't know, what I make this out of. Piece of 1/2 inch mild steel, what the guard made out of. And the handle is Desert Ironwood. Hard as a brick. This is Black Iron Hunter. And I'm tickled with it. I'm just going to keep making this knife until people are tired of seeing it, or I'm tired of making it. I hope others. It's 3/4 of an inch. It's 3/4 of an inch thick. But, yep, it's 3/4 of an inch thick. 4 3/4 inch blade. 4 3/8 inch handle. Take down. I'm not going to bother to take it down. I'll do an individual movie on this. But anyway, this is Black Iron Hunter. I hope you like it. I only have so much Cru-Forge-V. I'll get down to I'll set so much aside for me, and then when it's done, it's done. So I hope you guys like it. Order them. I'm gonna offer these. And they'll all have Desert Ironwood handle. Not the fancy burl stuff. I want to keep these things affordable, but they'll be. I'll tell you what I will do. I'm going to take this apart. This isn't the official finial, but I did want to show you this. That the entire blade is parkerized. The tang is parkerized. You don't have to worry about stuff rusting down inside that handle. Okay? There's some grease on here to make it look pretty to you guys. The guard, double pin, so you want a hunting knife that's not going to rust and it's tough, and here you go. Black Iron Hunter. You guys have a good weekend. It's about half over. I forgot. And it comes. in a black sheath. Have a good one.